Welcome to The Explainer, where we're digging into the big ideas coming out of the 2026 World Economic Forum in Davos. And let me tell you, the main takeaway is pretty clear. The whole era of easy, predictable globalization, well, it's over. What we saw this year was a picture of a world that is way more competitive and a whole lot more uncertain. You know, this quote from Ukrainian President Zelensky really just set the tone for the entire event. He was talking about a frozen military conflict, of course, but his words became a powerful metaphor for everything else. It points to a world where the predators, whether they're geopolitical rivals or economic competitors, are constantly on the move, and the old, frozen solutions just don't cut it anymore. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dive into the major contradictions that define the forum. Then we'll unpack the new rules of global power. After that, we'll look at an economy that's really on edge and dig into why it feels like AI is hitting a wall. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with how to actually navigate this fractured new reality. So first up, this world of contradictions. The official theme at Davos was a spirit of dialogue. Sounds nice and optimistic, right? But the actual mood on the ground was something else entirely. Most people there were saying this is the most complex geopolitical moment since the Cold War. And that huge gap between the slogan and the reality, it really gets to the heart of the problem we're all facing. There was this one phrase that you kept hearing over and over again to explain this tension: multipolarity without multilateralism. So what does that mean? Well, multipolarity means that power is spreading out to more and more countries. But the without multilateralism part means that the institutions that create the rules of the road, like the UN, are getting weaker. It's like having way more cars on the highway, but all the traffic lights are suddenly broken. It's a recipe for chaos. Now take a look at this. This global risk report shows something absolutely fascinating. For the short term, the top risks are what you'd probably expect: economic fights, misinformation, political division. But look what happens when you jump to the long term. 10-year outlook. All of a sudden, the adverse outcomes of AI skyrockets into the top 5. That tells you there's a deep underlying anxiety that while AI seems like one thing now, it could become a much bigger, more systemic threat down the line. And that brings us to the new rules of power. Diplomacy today feels less like a polite negotiation and more like a full contact sport. The old alliances, the ones built on shared values and history, they're giving way to a much more transactional, what have you done for me lately style of politics. And there is no better example of this than a wild standoff that recently went down in the Arctic. So this whole situation over Greenland was the talk of Davos. You had the US basically weaponizing tariffs against its own allies to try and force them to go along with a plan for a new missile defense system. But then Europe actually banded together and pushed back hard, which led to this really tense compromise. It's a perfect case study of this new era of hardball diplomacy, where even your oldest friendships are constantly up for renegotiation. And that Greenland drama is a textbook example of that number one short-term risk we saw: geoeconomic confrontation. This is really the core idea of our time. It's where countries are using everything in their economic toolkit, sanctions, control over technology, access to markets, as weapons to win geopolitical battles. The line between economics and national security has basically been erased. They're the same thing now. Of course, all this pressure is forcing big players to change their game. In a direct response to situations like the one in Greenland, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a major shift. She gave this landmark speech on European independence, signaling that Europe sees its old dependencies as huge vulnerabilities. The new goal is to build up its own industrial and security strength so it can stand on its own 2 feet. Okay, so you have all this geopolitical friction, and no surprise, it's creating some serious fault lines in the global economy. And at Davos, you could hear 2 completely different stories about where things are headed, especially when it came to the United States. It was really a tale of 2 forecasts. On one side, you had US officials predicting a massive super boom. We're talking an incredible 6% GDP growth. But then you talk to pretty much any mainstream economist, and they were forecasting a much more sober 2.3%. Many of them were even whispering about stagflation light, that nasty mix of low growth and high inflation. This huge disconnect just shows how uncertain everything feels right now. All of that economic anxiety led to a much bigger, deeper question that was kind of humming just beneath the surface of every conversation in Davos. Is the US dollar's long reign as the world's undisputed top currency finally in danger? Now, nobody was predicting a total collapse, but they did point to 3 growing cracks in the dollar's foundation. First,
the gigantic size of U.S. government debt is making investors pretty nervous. Second, there's a real fear that political interference with the central bank could erode trust, which is the absolute bedrock of any currency. And third, and this is a really key point, the dollar is still on top mostly because there's just no other good alternative yet. It's the king by default, which isn't exactly a position of strength.
All right, let's switch gears to technology. Because if past Davos meetings were all about the limitless, magical future of AI, this year felt different. This year, it felt like AI slammed right into a physical wall. The whole conversation shifted from fancy algorithms to the brute force realities of hardware, energy, and just tons of capital. And nothing captured this shift better than the reports about OpenAI's Sam Altman. He wasn't just looking for money for research. The word was, he was trying to raise an absolutely astronomical amount of cash to build the actual physical infrastructure AI needs to run on. We're talking vast networks of new chip factories and massive data centers. Just think about that number for a second. $50 billion. That's more than the entire annual GDP of a lot of countries. What that number tells you is that AI has transformed. It's not just a software industry anymore. It's a heavy asset, capital-intensive beast. And that means its biggest bottlenecks are no longer lines of code. They're things like electricity grids and access to hardware. So while AI faces these new physical limits, it's also creating a huge challenge on the human side of the economy. And it's more subtle than just robots are taking our jobs. As Mohammed Kande from PwC put it so well, AI is actually dismantling the apprenticeship model that we've relied on for generations to train professionals. So here's the problem. How do you learn to become an expert in fields like law or accounting? You start by doing the boring, repetitive, entry-level work. But that is exactly the kind of work that AI is getting really good at automating. So if companies use AI for those basic tasks, they don't need to hire as many junior people. But if you don't have new people learning the ropes today, where are your senior experts going to come from in 20 years? The entire talent pipeline is in danger of breaking. Okay, so we've got all these fractures in geopolitics, in the economy, even in technology. So what's the bottom line? What were the big takeaways from Davos for how businesses and governments are supposed to actually get by in this new age of competition? Well, first, it was obvious that there are two competing visions for the future on the table. You had the US pushing its America first, transactional, security-focused agenda. And then you had China stepping into the gap, positioning itself as the champion of global trade and stability, offering what it calls inclusive globalization to a world that's getting tired of all the uncertainty. And all this really boils down to a new set of operating rules for the world. Rule number 1, security is now more important than efficiency. A resilient supply chain is worth more than the cheapest one. Rule 2, alliances are conditional. They have to be constantly earned and renegotiated. And rule number 3, AI's amazing growth is chained to the physical limits of our world, things like energy and capital. And that leaves us with one final big question that was hanging over every single conversation at Davos. For decades, the global project was all about efficiency, making things cheaper, faster, more interconnected. Now, we're shifting to a world built for resilience and security. And so the critical question for all of us is this: what are we willing to give up in terms of cost, growth, and openness to feel safe in this new fractured world?